Jordan Peterson has become a global celebrity by weaving together mythology, science, philosophy and religion into a compelling theory of everything. One of the most influential philosophers of the last decades did something similar. Ken Wilber is the creator of integral theory, another attempt to pull together much of the world's knowledge and spiritual traditions into a theory of everything. Integral theory gained a big following in the 90s and 2000s and remains influential. After serious health problems over the last decade, Ken Wilber is now returning to the conversation. What do these two hugely influential thinkers have in common? Where do they disagree? And what can they learn from each other?
A lot of times when it comes to Jordan Peterson, it's not that I'll disagree with much of what he says. I agree with much of what he says. It's some of the things that he leaves out. I find this a little bit interesting because he's clearly an integral thinker.
I wanted to bring in something I've heard David Dada say before, that theologically you can identify the masculine principle with the witnessing consciousness, and the feminine with the witnessed.
Yes.
Does that help? Is that a definition that might help expand this perspective?
Well, at this point, what you are getting into is a lot of different types of systems that, the fact that men and women have been on this planet for, a couple million years, there have been at least certain types of differences that we've noticed. If nothing else, women give birth and lactate. Men, on average, have a slightly greater upper body strength. So you can take a really brilliant feminist systems theorist like Janet Schaff, and she'll say that what we have to do in order to understand the differences in the different roles that men and women have had is that we do have to start with at least a few biological universals and then look at how those play themselves out in different techno-economic modes, for example. And that's an important type of addition. It's part of what we call showing up in integral, because we're looking at all four quadrants. And the techno-economic mode is the lower right quadrant. It's you're looking at a society from an exterior objective fashion. And the stages that are often used there, for example, are Gerhard Linsky, who came up with the stages of foraging, or hunting and gathering, and then horticultural, agrarian, industrial, and informational. And Janet Schaff took just those two biological differences and showed how they produce dramatically different roles for men and women at these different techno-economic modes. This is one of the reasons you have to take quadrants into account when you make these kinds of statements. So even given those differences that are pretty hard to deny, at least in terms of biological, where we say upper right, exterior of an individual viewpoint. In foraging, sex roles were just barely being differentiated anyway, but the men tended to do those items that required upper body strength, so they tended to do hunting and would tend to be more warriors. And then women tended to give birth and lactate, and they just sort of played that out. When you get to horticultural, you start to see a real shift. Horticultural is the first form of farming, and it's defined as farming that just uses a simple digging stick or hoe. And the important thing about that is that a pregnant woman can do that kind of farming without any real harm to her. And Schaffes estimates that in horticultural societies, about 80% of the foodstuff were produced by women. And so they clearly are having an enormous impact in the public productive sphere. They're not just in the private reproductive sphere. And as a matter of fact, in horticultural societies, one study showed that approximately 1/3 of horticultural societies had female-only deities. And these are all the great mother societies. And when these matriarchal societies were first discovered under the patriarchal society, there was a massive discovery. It was like, wow. And of course, the feminists jumped all over. It's like, women were first and then men took it away and all of that. But it was a huge discovery. And it was discovering just this horticultural base and the way that took differences in human biology, but still played them out very differently in terms of roles. Men were still kind of trying to go off and do hunting and stuff, but women were producing 80% of the food because that was coming from farming. And so they had a role in the public productive sphere. And again, about a third of those deities were female only. And that's almost the only place you find that. Whenever you find a great mother society, it tends to be horticultural. Well, then agrarian came into being. That was farming done with an extremely heavy animal-drawn plow. Now, according to Shafez, women that did that suffered an extremely high rate of miscarriage. And it was to their Darwinian advantage not to do that. Plus, just the heaviness of the damn thing tended to select for men in their upper body strength. And so there was a big change. And one of the things that we find, there were other causes, but looking at this, this is an almost Marxist orientation, but the deities in agrarian cultures are 95% are male only. And if you want to start talking about something like a patriarchy, that's where you could really start to point at that and say, that's really patriarchal. Chavez's point is that you can't just say it's oppression. Women were choosing not to do that. And there are actually some studies of those kinds of patriarchal cultures that showed quality of life was much less for men than it was for women. Nevertheless, women did tend to then be in the private reproductive sphere, men in the public productive sphere, and that tended to start to get that kind of patriarchal orientation. Again, you have to be very careful about saying that was just men oppressing women. That's something that really drives Peterson crazy. And I share some of that because it takes away the agency of women. And I found that one of the most disturbing factors of the feminist theories that tried to do that and tried to blame all female conditions to oppression, because it takes away their agency, as if they actually had nothing to say or do about these societies, whereas they really were contributing in at least some important ways to how these were done. I don't know what women, those feminists, know that think that women would just acquiesce like sheep to everything that the men did to control them. But these aren't the women I know. I don't know where they're finding these women, but apparently that happened. Then when you start to get to industrial cultures, now you start to get a real shift, because now machines are doing the work on nature that human bodies used to have to do. And that takes that pressure out. So now there's no longer as strong a selection for male body upper strength and female birth and lactation. And so here we start to see, again, universal modes of morality. We start to see the rise of the women's movement. We start to see the freeing of slaves and abolition. And all of this is going against the traditional roles that were laid down during agrarian, which is men do all the public making decisions, women stay home and run the household and the family. And those were roles that both of them were stuck with. It's not like one of those was a whole lot of fun and the other was miserable. I mean, men died 8 years sooner. They had to fight in war. They had virtually all of the death-inducing jobs they had. The state could force them to give their lives. Warren Farrell called them the disposable sex. I mean, it wasn't that they just had it all bad, but they didn't have it all good. It wasn't like they arranged a society that gave them the best of everything and women the worst of everything. Because if they did that, they did a shitty job. So that can't be an idealistic version for men. It can't be. So then as we move into informational, then there's even less drive for physical force. And what we're facing now is this possibility that men and women just have different interests. And now they're more free to express them. And so Peterson's point about that is that in countries like Scandinavia, where you have the most freedom for men and women, they actually show the greatest differences in terms of preferences. And so what's that all about? Well, it's not just oppression. It could be some, but the oppression also, remember, is basically modernity gets blamed for all of these horrifying roles. But modernity was halfway through the cure. They were starting to get rid of these agrarian roles, which were very patriarchal. Again, not necessarily just through oppression, but just through the differentiation of what the sexes did. And the absolute brutality of nature and what we had to do just to stay alive. And that didn't include men having councils all the time trying to figure out how to oppress women. It was mostly men and women thinking together, what are we going to do to manage to stay alive? And yes, there was oppression, and that was during the ethnocentric era. So of course there was racism and slavery and one tribe against other tribes and all of that. Those roles are what the modern rational industrial society started to overcome. And then they become even more so in information. And what we're trying to do now is, because we have this leading edge green, which is broken mostly, not allowing us to even discuss these issues. Because everything simply has to be equal outcome. And if it's not, there's discrimination. There's sexism, there's racism, there's something going on. And again, the difficulty is that it's not that those aren't occurring, it's just those aren't only occurring. There are other reasons that it's occurring, and those aren't necessarily bad. Those have to be allowed, or else you're going to start erasing those as well, and you're going to end up doing what you did with hierarchies. You're going to try to get rid of all the dominator hierarchies, and you're going to get rid of all the growth hierarchies, and then you're going to have to get no way to even grow to the values that you're trying to get established. You've lost the path to it. So all you can do is protest and yell and scream, and it doesn't do any good at all. So